So you're
It is a great honor to welcome Michael Mandelbaum to this program. He is the director of the American Foreign Policy Program at Johns Hopkins University. How are you today, Michael? Thank you for joining the show.
My pleasure. Glad to be with you and your audience.
Thank you. The pleasure is all mine. So this conversation is focused on your latest book, which is titled The Four Ages of American Foreign Policy. I should like to begin by asking you, so yes, yes, there's a book right there. It's a bit obscured by the background, but there's a book. So my first question is, we are a year into the Russian Federation's war on Ukraine, which if you're seeing on video, you can see the two countries right there. One is bigger than the other. What can we reasonably conclude about how the war is going and how it may end?
Well, thank you. I should say that the book that I've written, The Four Ages of American Foreign Policy, ends in 2015 because 2015 was the end point of the fourth era of American foreign policy. That is the era of the United States as the world's hyperpower. And in that period, the United States faced no serious rivals and had no serious security problems. Well, that age is obviously over at the moment. We're in a fifth era, and the Russian attack on Ukraine is one of the clear indications that we are in a new era. There obviously are serious security problems for the United States and the world. There are three countries that are trying to upset the political status quo in their respective regions: China in East Asia, Russia in Europe, and Iran in the Middle East. Excuse me. And the Russian attack on Ukraine is a symptom. War is always unpredictable. We don't know how this one is going to come out. We do know that Russia has failed and Ukraine has succeeded, in the sense that Russia believed that it would be easy to conquer Ukraine, eliminate the democratically elected Ukrainian government, and retake the Ukrainian, what used to be the Ukrainian province, into Greater Russia. And of course, Ukraine was part of Russia for some centuries. That failed. Ukraine has resisted, fought off that initial effort, and successfully counterattacked. The question now is whether we are in a protracted stalemate, or whether either side, and more specifically Ukraine, will be able to make military progress and take back more of the territory that Russia now occupies. It's widely believed that Ukraine will launch an offensive in the coming weeks and months. It is generally expected that that offensive will take place in the south, in the region of Kherson and Zaporizhia. The Ukrainians have received a flow of Western weapons and have been training on this weapons, which gives them some prospect of succeeding. If they do succeed, then they will be able to retake much of the territory, most of the territory that Russia has occupied since February 2022, leaving aside the northern part of Ukraine that Russia occupied in 2014. And if the Ukrainian offensive takes place and succeeds, that will tilt the balance of advantage in the war toward Ukraine. But we don't know whether this offensive will succeed. We don't even really know whether it will take place. And if it does, we don't know whether that will be enough to end the war by persuading the Russians that they should make a negotiated settlement rather than continue. So we may be on the verge of a major episode in this war that could change things. But even if it changes things in the way that the Ukrainians hope and anticipate, that doesn't necessarily mean that the war will end. Vladimir Putin seems to have a strong incentive to keep fighting, if only because once the fighting is over, there's likely to be a reckoning in Russia. And that could go badly for him. He badly miscalculated, and he has, in effect, thrown away 100,000 Russian lives for not much gain.
Do you have any thoughts on the John Mearsheimer line of thinking, which says that the reason why Russia invades Ukraine is because the West and the U.S. keeps pushing NATO eastward, and the Russians have no choice but to retaliate?
No, I don't agree with that. When NATO expansion was first proposed in the early 1990s, I actively opposed it because I believed, and others believed, and we turned out to be correct, that this would have the effect of alienating Russia, of undercutting the democratic forces in Russia, which were then stronger than they are now, and of turning Russia against the West, since the West leaders had promised that NATO would not expand eastward. So I thought that NATO expansion was a mistake. It went ahead and it did alienate Russia, not just the Russian leaders, but also the Russian people. That contributed to the invasion of Ukraine indirectly because it created a climate of opinion in Ukraine that was strongly anti-Western and enabled Putin to persuade the Russians wrongly that the West in general and the United States in particular were seeking to weaken and even destroy Russia. And that meant that Putin's aggressive foreign policies made him popular in Russia, as would not have been the case had Russian public opinion not changed. So I think that NATO expansion contributed to the war in Ukraine indirectly by making Vladimir Putin and his foreign policies plausible to the Russians as they would not have been otherwise. However, I do not believe that the prospect of imminent Ukrainian membership in NATO was what triggered Putin's attack on February 22nd, 2022. In fact, NATO is a defensive alliance. The United States and the West were not seeking to weaken or destroy Russia. And Ukraine was not going to be taken into NATO as a member at that point, as Putin certainly knew or could have known, because his frequent interlocutor, French President Emmanuel Macron, could, and I think probably did, tell him that. And Macron had a veto as president of France, a NATO member, over the addition of Ukraine. So I think while I do believe that NATO expansion in the mid-1990s was a mistake, we're almost 30 years beyond that. Many things have happened. And I believe that Putin invaded Ukraine not for defensive purposes, but rather for imperial purposes and in order to bolster his own standing in Russia. So again, to summarize, at its origin, NATO expansion was, I believe, a mistake and had long-term consequences that are unfavorable for the West and that even contributed very indirectly to the Russian attack of 2022. But I do not believe that Putin had good reason to believe, or indeed did believe, that Ukraine was about to join NATO.
Mhm. So, as of today, 18th of May, 2023, the leading Russian dissident, I believe Vladimir Kara-Murza, was arrested and sent into jail for 25 years. All the while, an American reporter from the Wall Street Journal has also been imprisoned by the Russian government. So I wonder if we can draw one or more connections between um, the Federation's anti-democratic policies with its imperial militaristic foreign policy.
I think they do go together. Bear in mind that dissidents and Democrats were being repressed and arrested and even murdered before Putin invaded Ukraine. But I do believe that Putin's chief aim is to remain in power as a dictator. When he first became Russian president, he was able to accumulate some popularity and legitimacy because the Russian economy was going well. People were getting richer, and he got credit for that. But when he came back to power for his second stint as president, the sources of prosperity had gone. He was able to preside over a prosperous Russia because of a sharp rise in the price of oil, which is Russia's main and in some ways only serious export. But the price stabilized and then fell, and so he had to find another basis for ginning up support and popularity. And his choice was to conduct a foreign policy that is assertively nationalist and now imperialist, on the theory that if he were able to expand Russia's power, influence, and territory and do it easily, this would redound to his benefit politically in Russia. In fact, I published a book in 2019 called The Rise and Fall of Peace on Earth, which has a chapter on Russia that argues that this need for some basis for legitimacy other than economic prosperity goes a long way in explaining Putin's aggressive imperial foreign policy. So I do think that Russia's domestic structure, with Putin gathering all power into his own hands, and Russia's aggressive imperialist foreign policy are closely related.
Mm-hmm. So going back to America, I think I would apply the same question. So I'm from Vietnam, and I think unlike, say, certain people in Latin America who believes that the U.S. foreign policy is very consistent and is consistently against them. Vietnamese and I think other East Asian countries too believe that it is very inconsistent in that it has a list of very consistent principles which are noble enough, but their conduct, the conduct of U.S. foreign policy changes with every president that has been elected, sometimes even within the presidency's first versus the second term. So does America's domestic policy and society influence its conduct abroad?
2 points there. In my book, The Four Ages of American Foreign Policy, I argue that the United States has from the beginning had two approaches to foreign policy. One of them is called by students of international relations realism. It emphasizes power, the use or threat to use military force, the protection of interests, and it sees the optimal possible international configuration as a stable balance of power. The second approach, which is distinctively and characteristically American, because realism is the kind of foreign policy that most countries at most points in history have practiced, but the alternative American approach emphasizes the promotion of American ideas and ideals and institutions and values beyond the borders of the United States, the most important of these being democracy within countries and peace among them. Now, these two approaches to foreign policy have been present from the beginning of the United States at the end of the 18th century. Sometimes they reinforce one another, as they did in World War II and the Cold War, which the United States waged both to defend its interests and to promote and protect its values. But sometimes they conflict. And when they conflict, there is conflict in the United States over foreign policy. When they have conflicted, the United States has usually opted for a realist foreign policy. It has usually opted to defend its interests rather than to promote its values. But the promotion of values has never gone away. It's always been important. It's always been on the American foreign policy agenda. And indeed, this emphasis on the promotion of certain values, which is greater in the history of American foreign policy, as I show in my book, than in the history of the foreign policy of any other country, excuse me, is one of the things that is distinctively American about American foreign policy. One other point in response to your question. American foreign policy tends, excuse me, to change not so much with changes of presidency, but with events that happen beyond America's borders. So, for example, George W. Bush came into office proclaiming that he was going to pursue a humble foreign policy. And yet, he turned out to pursue a foreign policy that was more idealist, that was more interested in spreading American values than almost any other president. The reason for that was the terrorist attacks on Washington, D.C. and New York of September 11th, 2001, and all that followed from them. Moreover, American foreign policy has been pretty consistent. It was pretty consistent during what I call the third era of American foreign policy in my book, The 4 Ages of American Foreign Policy. Excuse me. That was the era of the United States as a superpower. And in that era, the United States pursued a policy of containing the Soviet Union and communism, especially in Europe, and did so for 4.5 decades through presidencies of different parties. There is a literature, which I deal with in my book, on American foreign policy that holds that American foreign policy is bound to be inconsistent because it is democratic, and public opinion is fickle and pushes the United States in different directions. I think on the whole, that criticism, that analysis, which was originally made by Alexis de Tocqueville, the Frenchman who wrote a great book about the United States in the 19th century, and was taken up in the 20th century by such commentators on and practitioners of foreign policy as George F. Kennan, that turns out not to be true, or at least not to be as relevant as those observers thought. During the Cold War, the United States was quite consistent. But it is true that public opinion has always had an unusually pronounced impact on American foreign policy compared with the foreign policies of other countries. And public opinion does shift. It is difficult to predict, and that has meant that American foreign policy has been difficult to predict for other countries, especially America's adversaries. North Korea never expected that the United States would send troops to protect South Korea in 1950. The Soviet Union did not expect that the United States would give aid to the Afghan resistance after the Soviet invasion of Afghanistan in 1979. Saddam Hussein, when he invaded and occupied Kuwait in 1990, certainly didn't expect that the United States would muster an army of almost 500,000 troops and send it to the Middle East to evict his army from Kuwait. So, from the point of view of America's adversaries, the United States has proven to be somewhat unpredictable.
So, if I have my history of the United States correctly, from the time of its founding to, I suppose, 1917, the foreign policy which the states have conducted is what you would describe as isolationist. We want nothing to do abroad. But starting with 1917 and Woodrow Wilson, the consensus is that the US should have a presence abroad, and isolationism is no longer a luxury that we can afford. So what has changed?
Good question. Let me respond with 2 points. First, historians of American foreign policy don't like the term isolationism, and I don't like it either, because the United States, from its origins, never thought that it could or should be isolated from the world. From the very beginning, the United States wanted to trade with the rest of the world and wanted to trade as much as possible. Moreover, at the end of the 19th century, the United States became very active in East Asia. President Theodore Roosevelt spent a lot of his presidency trying to contrive a stable balance of power in East Asia. What was true of the United States until 1917 was that it did not wish to become involved in the military and political affairs of Europe. In its early years, the United States couldn't avoid that in what I call the first era of American foreign policy in my book, The 4 Ages of American Foreign Policy. When America was a weak power, it got caught up in the wars of the French Revolution because even though it wished to avoid them. And there were a number of important events in early American foreign policy that stemmed directly from the wars of the French Revolution at the end of the 18th and beginning of the 19th century, including the second war that the United States fought against Great Britain, the War of 1812, which ended in 1815. So the United States wanted to avoid European security affairs, but didn't manage to do so until after 1815. But there followed a century when the United States, although interested in trading with other countries and active in Central America and East Asia, stayed out of European affairs. That changed, of course, with World War I, which the United States entered in 1917. What changed? Well, the most important thing that changed, and this is a major theme of the 4 Ages of American foreign policy, is that the United States became more powerful. By the end of the 19th century, America had by far the largest economy in the world. And by 1917, the United States had already become, although in a way indirectly, accidentally, and reluctantly, and on a small scale, an imperial power. It had annexed the Philippines after the Spanish-American War of 1898. So when George Washington gave his farewell address and said that the United States should not become involved in the affairs of Europe, he did so because he felt that the United States was weak enough so that it would only be manipulated by European powers. A century later, that was no longer true. The United States was a giant economically, and in fact, got involved in World War I ultimately for economic reasons. The United States traded with Great Britain, traded with the Allied powers, loaned money to the British because it was in the American economic interest. The United States, as a neutral power in World War I until 1917, was perfectly willing in principle to trade with the Central Powers, to trade with Germany. But because Britain controlled the Atlantic Ocean, no commerce could reach Germany. The Germans were very upset about this. They felt that the British were trying to strangle them with a blockade, as indeed the British were. And so they started sinking British ships with the new instrument of warfare, the submarine. But submarine warfare offended Woodrow Wilson and Americans in general. And Wilson said that the Germans had to stop it. And the Germans did stop it for a while, but then resumed it. And Wilson and the American Congress and the American public took that as a cause of war. But they could afford to enter World War I because the United States had increased since its founding its territory, its population, and its economic output. Power does make a difference, made a big difference in the history of American foreign policy that I recount. And I divide the history of American foreign policy over 250 years, from 1765 to 2015, into four distinct eras, each of which is defined by greater American power. The United States grew increasingly powerful over those 250 years, and that formed the basis for American foreign policy in these four eras.
Well, what really fascinates me is that from 1917 onward, the United States has basically conducted its foreign policy based on the 14 points that Wilson drafted out, so Wilsonian principles. But I do not believe that Woodrow Wilson would rank high among the, I guess, American presidents' tier list from good to bad. Well, everyone from conservatives to progressives can find bad things about him, say Palmer raids, first red scare, racism, promoting the Ku Klux Klan, ushering in an era of progressivism which enlarged the government. And even Wilsonianism itself was responsible for the failure of the League of Nations and the Treaty of Versailles. So what is it about Woodrow Wilson's influence that, I guess, transcended his person, his achievements as president?
Well, again, that's a very good question. Of all of the 45 or 46 presidents that the United States has had, I think Woodrow Wilson remains the most controversial, although there's a lot of competition for that distinction. Thomas Jefferson, for example, is controversial today. And in the four ages of American foreign policy, I pass a rather negative judgment on Jefferson's foreign policy, despite the fact that he was the author of the Louisiana Purchase, which vastly expanded the scope, the geographic scope of the United States. What is my verdict on Wilson? My verdict on Wilson, and I think this helps to account for the controversy surrounding him, is that he was an unsuccessful president, but a very successful prophet. That is to say, when World War I ended, he went to Europe with a set of principles that he wanted to implement, and they were set out in the 14 points. But the realities of international politics were such that he could not fully implement them. And that's always true for statesmen. The world is a resistant medium. Nobody ever gets everything he or she wants. But Wilson disappointed many of his followers by not achieving all that he set out to achieve. And in what came to be his primary goal, the League of Nations, he failed. He did not persuade the United States Senate to ratify American membership in the League of Nations. How and why that happened is a complicated story that I do tell in the 4 Ages of American Foreign Policy. But I think one has to say that a good deal of his failure with the League can be explained by political incompetence, although it's also true that bad health played a role. He had a very serious stroke in the midst of the League fight. So as a politician, as a statesman in his own time, Wilson was, to a large extent, a failure. And yet, the ideas that he articulated lived on after him. They did so because they fit in with the idealist tradition in American foreign policy that goes all the way back to the founding of the Republic in the 18th century and before. Wilson was their most notable champion and exponent. So notable, in fact, that this strain of American foreign policy is sometimes called Wilsonianism. And those ideas have not died out. America has retained its allegiance to them. America has continued to try to implement these ideas with, at best, mixed success, but has never given up on Wilson's ideas. And indeed, those ideas have become more prominent over time in the century since Woodrow Wilson died than they were during his lifetime. They become more prominent in the United States, and they become more prominent in other countries as well. The world is, at least rhetorically, more Wilsonian now than it was during Woodrow Wilson's lifetime. And I might add that, in a way, the most Wilsonian entity in the world today, the one that is most committed to Woodrow Wilson's ideas, is the European Union. The European Union believes in self-determination. It believes in human rights. It believes in free trade. So Wilson's ideas have outlived him and have even flourished since his time. So the combination of his failure in his lifetime as a statesman and the continuing and widening influence of the ideas that he proposed and with which he is identified since his death accounts for the controversy and the paradox surrounding his historical reputation.
I'd like to examine America's foreign policy in regards to two of its allies, Britain and France. In the 18th century, France was America's first and greatest ally. You can say Marquis de Lafayette and Thomas Jefferson being the ambassador of France, of the U.S. to France after the revolution happened. Both of these revolutions are based on roughly the same principles. And Britain at the time was obviously the United States' greatest enemy and the colonial power who wishes to have her territory back. But in the 20th century, save for the Suez Canal crisis, the United States and Britain have had no real opposition in regard to foreign policy. But France, save for a few episodes, has been vocally in opposition to America's foreign policy, from de Gaulle not volunteering his troops to Vietnam contra Johnson, to Chirac not sending troops to Iraq contra Bush and Blair. So what happened in the decades, centuries since?
Well, another good question. One could go further, and I do go further in the four ages of American foreign policy in saying that not only was France America's first ally, the United States could not have won its independence without France. France, French support, French military power was absolutely indispensable. But the United States continued to be tied to Britain economically. Britain was the greatest trading nation in the world. It had the strongest navy, the strongest fleet, and America was connected economically to Britain throughout the 19th century, even as it rubbed up against Britain politically. Moreover, at the beginning of the American Republic, there were two visions for the kind of country it should become. One was Thomas Jefferson's. He wanted it to be largely agrarian, a country of yeoman farmers. The other was his great rival, Alexander Hamilton, who was the first Secretary of the Treasury and a close aide to George Washington. And Hamilton admired Great Britain, even though he fought in the Revolutionary War. And he thought that the United States should aspire to be like Great Britain, a great commercial republic, which Jefferson opposed. But the Hamiltonian strain in American thinking persisted throughout the 19th century, and the United States became more like Great Britain. The United States had a number of diplomatic conflicts with Great Britain over territory, because Great Britain was, after all, a North American power by virtue of its possession of Canada. And there were times when it seemed that there might yet be another war between the United States and Great Britain, but cooler heads always prevailed. And by the end of the 19th century, Great Britain decided that its international interest would be best served by good relations with the United States. So it decided to appease the United States. The first episode of appeasement came not toward Nazi Germany in the 1930s, but toward the United States at the end of the 19th and the beginning of the 20th centuries. So Great Britain pursued a policy of conciliation in Latin America and also in East Asia. And that smoothed out American relations with Great Britain. And in World War I, the United States came to regard Germany as a threat and Great Britain as an ally. Certainly, Great Britain was an important economic partner, and the British did all they could to win the United States to their side after World War I broke out and after World War II broke out. And at the end of World War II, the British could see that they were not going to be able to maintain their empire, but they wanted to maintain as much influence in the world as they could. And so they got the idea of a special relationship with the United States, where they would be the partner with the new great global power, junior partner perhaps, but at least a partner. So it is British foreign policy that has changed over the course of 2.5 centuries, and it's changed because of our old friend power. Britain became far less powerful compared with the rest of the world. And so it sought to join with the United States in order to protect its interests and promote its influence. France, I would not say has ever been an adversary of the United States. And bear in mind that the United States fought as an ally of France in World War I. It was an ally and a sponsor, although in a way a reluctant one, of Free France in World War II. And France is a charter member of NATO and has been part of NATO ever since. But France's response to the decline in its power and influence and its loss of an empire has been in an effort, the same kind of effort that Britain made, to sustain as much influence and power in the world as it could. But its strategy was the opposite of the British one. Its strategy was to put some distance between itself and the United States and try to make its relative independence, and it was only relative, a source of a renewed or continued importance in the world. But when the chips were down, France always sided with the United States. During the Cuban Missile Crisis, President Kennedy sent an emissary to de Gaulle to explain the American position and why the Americans were demanding the removal of Russian missiles from Cuba. And the emissary came armed with satellite photographs to show that there were missiles in Cuba. And when he came in to see de Gaulle, he said, I will show you, Mr. President, our evidence. De Gaulle said, there's no need to show it. I assume the United States is right about this. So France has been, from the American point of view, a kind of gadfly. Chirac, Macron, and above all, de Gaulle. And the Gaullist tradition, which de Gaulle initiated, has continued in France and in French foreign policy, but it has never succeeded in restoring France's previous glory, and it is not aimed at a break with the United States.
So perhaps the litmus test to show whether one's view for American foreign policy is idealist or realist is the question of America's alliance with Israel, now celebrating its 75th year. It's not unreasonable to say that the United States has been more than just an ally, but it plays kind of a godparently role to the Jewish state. And of course, the reason for continued American alliance with Israel is, well, one, there's a religious reason, which says that the proof of Israel's existence and thriving is it's God's will being manifest on earth. The Jewish people have finally got to be at the land where they were dispersed from. And Wilsonian principles, of course, in that Israel is a democratic country and it fulfills the principle of self-determination, a historic and indigenous population has finally created a state of their own. But although there are realists who supported the American alliance with Israel, say Kissinger, the general realist view, as expressed by, say, John Mearsheimer, is that because of the volatile condition in the Middle East, would it not be better if the U.S. established allyships with any other country that is more powerful than Israel? And that leads to certain like mendacious interpretations that there's such a thing as an Israel lobby, but the logic still stands. If America continues to ally itself with Israel, it would likely alienate every other country in the Middle East.
Well, let me give you a different interpretation. First, as to Mearsheimer, he's simply wrong about the United States, Israel, and the Middle East. Israel has been a strategic asset for a long time, which is why the part of the United States government that most values the Israel connection is the Pentagon, because Israel has a serious military force. Moreover, the country in the Middle East, the non-Israeli country that matters most to the United States is Saudi Arabia, and with it, the Gulf states. And they are now basically allied with Israel. So the idea that the United States has to choose between the two is nonsense, and in fact was never the case. It's not true either that the United States has been the godfather of Israel. Israel was most vulnerable in its first decade when it had no alliance with the United States. In fact, the first country to recognize Israel and the country that made it possible for Israel to get the arms that enabled it to win its war of independence was the Soviet Union. The American State Department did not want to recognize Israel, did not want to be allied with Israel. So, and Israel's weaponry through 1956 and really through 1967, and its most important wars were fought in 48 56 and 67, the weapons didn't come from the United States, and it didn't get a diplomatic support from the United States. The weapons were French. The Israeli Air Force was flying Mirages when it knocked out the Egyptian and Syrian Air Forces in June of 1967. So that's one point to bear in mind. When Israel needed a godfather, the United States was not available. The era of close Israeli-American relations is the era when Israel became much stronger, and that leads to a second point. The American alliance with Israel, and by the way, it's not a formal alliance. Israel has never wanted a formal alliance. And unlike all other American allies, Israel has never wanted American forces to defend it. It has insisted on defending itself. But the American alliance or the American alignment is rooted in both realism and Wilsonianism. The United States has valued Israel because it is the strongest military power in the Middle East, and it acts in ways congenial and compatible with the interests of the United States. So there are plenty of people in the United States who don't have any judgment, any opinion on what God wants for the Middle East or the Jewish people, but who value a very capable ally. But it's also true that there are Wilsonian ties, and they're not only, and perhaps not even mainly, religious ties. They're political ties in the sense that Israel is the only democracy in the Middle East. Israel is the only country that preaches and practices American political values, and Americans appreciate that. And so they are happy to be aligned with Israel. Israel is one of the most popular countries in the United States among Americans. They're happy because Israel is pro-American, practices American beliefs and values, and does not ask Americans to die for
it. Okay. Well, I wonder, with the renewed militarism of the Russian Federation and the renewed militarism and anti-Americanism of the People's Republic of China, should we expect a return to great power politics?
I think we're already there. Well, one of the reasons we know that we're now in a fifth era of American foreign policy is that security, competition, and power politics have returned. What that means is that there are not only opposing views and goals as affects the United States and other countries, but these opposing goals could turn into open warfare. This has already happened in Europe with the Russian invasion of Ukraine. China is menacing Taiwan, threatens to invade. And Iran is already subverting governments around the Middle East, has its tentacles in Syria, in Lebanon, in Yemen, and is moving toward acquiring a nuclear weapon. So not only can we anticipate the return of power politics in the future, we can see it in the present.
I think there's a line of thinking that I find increasingly reasonable, is that the United States, during its era of the unipolar moment, as Charles Krauthammer put it, may have enabled, well, first the two great powers, Russian Federation and the People's Republic, to be great powers to begin with its extending the Russian Federation into the G7 group and increasing economic interdependence with the People's Republic. And in the case of Iran, well, you can look at the Obama's disastrous Joint Comprehensive Plan of Action, which actually accelerated the Islamic Republic into acquiring a nuclear weapon of its own. So is the foreign policy landscape of the world America's own making?
Another very good question. I take up precisely this question in the fourth part of the Four Ages of American Foreign Policy, the era of American hyperpower. And I give, and I will give here, three different answers to the question as regards the three principal challengers. As regards Russia, I think the United States was too tough at the wrong time. NATO expansion was the expression of that misguided policy. The United States should have been trying harder to integrate Russia, which in the 1990s had a democratically inclined President Boris Yeltsin and was relatively favorable or not unfavorable to the West. We unintentionally pushed Russia away, pushed it into opposition. And that was a serious mistake on the part of the United States and on the part of the Clinton administration, which made that mistake. With Iran, I think the United States was not tough enough. The only way to stop the Iranian nuclear program, short of using force against it, was to be credible in the threat to use force if it did not cease that program. Barack Obama took the opposite tack. He tried to conciliate Iran. He seems to have had in his mind the idea that he could do for Iran what Richard Nixon did for China in 1972. That was always misguided, and it has come back to haunt us. As for the third current challenger, China, there, I'm not sure there's anything the United States could reasonably have done. Americans believed in the 90s and afterwards that economic engagement with China, leading to rapid Chinese economic growth, would in turn promote political liberalization and a peaceful foreign policy in the People's Republic. And to some extent, it did, at least for a while. Had the United States foreseen what China has become under Xi Jinping, it probably would have been more hesitant over the last 3 decades to engage as fully as it did with the People's Republic in economic terms. But I don't see how the United States could reasonably have retarded Chinese economic growth, which is the basis of its assertive nationalistic foreign policy. If the United States had declined to trade with China, the Europeans and the Japanese and the other East Asians would have done so. They wouldn't have not have allowed themselves to engage in an economic embargo of what seemed to be a liberalizing China just because the United States was doing it. And we have some evidence that even the United States couldn't have done that, because when Bill Clinton became president, he continued he tried to implement a kind of economic embargo on China as punishment for the Tiananmen episode in 1989. And he said that the granting of trade privileges to China would depend upon China improving its human rights record. Well, China did not improve its human rights record. It refused to be pressured by the United States. And in the United States, the American business community objected to Clinton's policy and forced Clinton to abandon it. So it's hard for me to imagine a plausible alternative course of action which would have prevented the kind of Chinese challenge that we see today.
So we started with the Russian war on Ukraine, but I think we should end it that way. There's a growing urge within American politics even to stop its armament and financial support for the Ukrainians and find a way to end the war with a peace agreement as soon as possible. And one of the compelling reasons that motivates this line of thinking is that the Russian Federation has nuclear weapons, and we cannot risk it actually using it in the ongoing war. And of course, the Cold War logic follows that because the United States also has nuclear weapons, the risk of a nuclear exchange is too high to ignore. So, what do you think of this particular line of thinking?
The fact that Russia has nuclear weapons has certainly conditioned American policy toward Ukraine and the Ukraine war and the Russian invasion from the beginning. For that reason, the United States has said that it will not send American or NATO troops to fight. For that reason, the United States has said that it will not create a no-fly zone over Ukraine to protect it against Russian aerial attacks, because that would involve NATO planes and that would involve direct conflict between NATO and Russian forces. And the fear is that once you got any kind of military contact between Russia and the West, there's a danger of escalation to nuclear weapons. The United States has also said that it will not support a Ukrainian invasion of Russian territory, although I don't think the Ukrainians are interested in annexing any part of Russia. So the nuclear dimension has been factored in from the beginning. The threat that the United States, excuse me, will cease its support or reduce its support from Ukraine comes from American domestic politics. There are some on the right wing of the Republican Party who simply don't like helping Ukraine, who claim that Ukraine is a corrupt country, that the United States shouldn't be involved. And I think one main reason for their objection is that the American support for Ukraine is identified with President Biden, who is a member of the opposition Democratic Party. Similarly, I think there are those on the left of the Democratic Party who would prefer not to support Ukraine because they want to spend all the money at home, and who believe that Europe is not important for the United States and the United States should concentrate on the third world. And they've been kept in line by the fact that it's a president of their party who is conducting this policy. If the Republicans retake the White House in 2024, and if the war is still going on, some Democrats might cease to support it. Excuse me. All that said, I'm impressed by how robust the American support for Ukraine has been since the beginning, now for going on 15, 18 months. And I attribute it, excuse me, to two things. First, there are no American troops involved. And second, supporting Ukraine is consistent with both a realist and a Wilsonian approach to foreign policy. And that means, excuse me, that it has the chance to attract wide support.
So if a peace agreement is conducted and the war is concluded, is it possible that Ukraine will retain the territories that it has had before March of 2022, or even Crimea back?
That all depends on what happens on the battlefield. Ukraine will get those territories back only by conquering them. I suspect, although I don't know any more than anybody else, I suspect that Ukraine will not get back Crimea and will not get back most of the Donbass, that is the territory conquered by Russia in 2014, not 2022. I suspect that the best the Ukrainians will be able to do is get back to the borders of February 2022. And I also suspect that although the Ukrainian position, understandably, is that they must get back all of the territory they had before 2014, they may not be all that interested in regaining Crimea, which was always majority Russian, or the Donbass, which was Russian speaking, and which is part of the old Soviet Rust Belt with large military industries that are not profit making anymore, meaning that the Ukrainian government just had to support a lot of unemployed people. I suspect the Ukrainians may believe, although they won't say so publicly, that they can do without Crimea and they are better off without most of the Donbass. Now, I don't know that for a fact. I could be quite wrong, but that is my suspicion. So I think the optimal outcome for Ukraine, for the West, and for the world is for Ukraine to get back to its borders of February 22nd, 2022. Whether that is possible will depend on the outcome of the upcoming, so we're told, Ukrainian offensive in the south.
Well, on that note, thank you very much, Michael Mandelbaum of Johns Hopkins University, for joining this program.
Thank you.
Yes, his latest book is The 4 H's of American Foreign Policy. So thank you again, and do take care of yourself.
Thank you.